So how long will it take us?
45 minutes to 1 hour, 45 minutes.
Oh, that's not much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory. Thank you for joining us on our first strategic talk. In Trends Strategic Talks, Trends Research and Advisory aims to engage as strategic partners in promoting a deeper understanding of global issues, the Middle East, and Gulf countries, through bringing together senior experts to engage in an enriching dialogue while offering fresh and valuable viewpoints. Trends has previously hosted 3 strategic talks. Our first talk was held with the George Washington University on March 25, and it has shed light on the peace accord tactics and strategies between the UAE and Israel. Our second strategic talk was hosted in collaboration with the Middle Eastern Institute at the National University of Singapore on the 7th of April, where trans researchers gave a strategic overview of the GCC's economies and future trends. While our third talk was with the Center for Behavioral and Cognitive History at the Erskine College in South Carolina on the 19th of April, and it has touched on the current strategic changes in the Middle East, and more specifically on the Abrahamic Accord. And now we hold our fourth strategic talk with the Russian International Affairs Council that will provide us with an understanding of the Gulf security and its importance to the global politics and security climate from 2 regional and global powers. I'll give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Nath, a professor of international relations at Shandong University, China. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Amal. I am pleased to start this pleasant afternoon with Dr. Christian Alexander and Dr. Nikolai Sharkov. The subject of today's discussion is about Gulf security, the views of the United Arab Emirates and of Russia on security issues related to peace and enhancing peace in the region. The discussion and analysis about the security in the Gulf is of global interest in ways that the Gulf region has impacted global interactions, the geostrategic location, the natural resources of the region, and also the continuing involvement of global powers in the region has always created a security complex in the Gulf. However, Gulf states have gone long way from the impact of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War to create a security complex with and working together and with international powers to achieve peace and also to promote peace in the region. To discuss these issues, we have Dr. Alexander, Christian Alexander. He is a Director of International Security and Terrorism Program at Trends Research and Advisory. He is advisor at the Gulf States Analytics, Washington-based geopolitical risk consultancy. Previously served as an assistant professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. And Dr. Alexander's publications are widely distributed and including in the Middle East Institute, the Arab Gulf States Institute, International Policy Digest, International Institute for the Middle East and Balkan Studies. His research examines social movements in the Middle East and security-related issues, with particular focus on migration in the GCC states. Dr. Nikolai Sharkov is a PhD holder from Moscow State University, Moscow State University Institute of Asian and African Studies. Dr. Sharkov is a senior researcher for the Center of Middle East Studies at Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Russian Academy of Science. Associate professor at the Department of Oriental Studies, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which is a renowned and important institution in Russian affairs and in Russian diplomatic studies. His research interests include international relations of the Middle East, domestic and foreign policy of Arab states, regional, inter-ethnic, and interfaith conflicts, and military affairs. We welcome both the guests on the discussion today, focusing on the views of the UAE and also of Russia on security and strategic arrangements in the region. I start with Dr. Christian. Please, you have the floor now, and you're both welcome, and thank you again for accepting the invitation to be our guests on this talk. Please, Dr. Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Nath, and welcome, Dr. Surkov. I'm glad to be here, and welcome to the audience out there. I just want to start my presentation with a disclaimer, emphasizing that the views expressed here are my own. They don't necessarily reflect the official view and policy of the UAE. So again, my personal analysis on this issue. So an interesting way of introducing the topic would be to look at the region as a regional security complex. Regional security complexes are obviously defined as states whose threat perceptions are so interlinked that their security problems cannot reasonably be analyzed or resolved apart from each other. So essentially, they are defined by two types of relationships. On the one hand, the power relationship, on the other hand, patterns of enmity and amity. The problem is that when this theoretical tool is applied to the region, most experts argue that the Middle East regional security complex is best understood as a combination of three semi-autonomous, almost distinct sub-regional security complexes. So the sub-regional security complex of the Maghreb, of the Levant, and finally that of the Gulf, each with its own separate security dynamics. I mean, that's the theoretical view of some of the experts out there. So as a result, most experts analyze Gulf security and strategic issues in isolation from developments taking place in the rest of the region. However, I think one of the changes that has taken place in the last 2 decades is the development of a much more integrated Middle East regional security complex. So key events that have taken place over the last 2 decades have led to much greater density of security interactions across the whole region. So as a result, threat perceptions and security dynamics in the Gulf today are clearly impacted by events taking place in the broader region and vice versa. So security dynamics in the Levant and the Maghreb are now closely intertwined and are affected by events taking place in the Gulf. In this context, regional stability of the Middle East, and not just simply the Gulf, meaning comprehensive Middle Eastern security, has emerged as top priority for the United Arab Emirates and has become one of the key strategic objectives in its foreign and security policy, with a number of initiatives and important themes of its external action aimed primarily at bringing about a more stable regional environment, at reestablishing a degree of stability in those areas defined by violence, political turmoil, and institutional decay. And so in this presentation, I would like to highlight 3 of them in particular. Let me start off with the first one, which has emerged as a key component of the country's push for regional stability, which is the fight against terrorism and the effort to confront extremism in all forms. It's obviously well recorded that the UAE, for instance, has been a key, very active member of the global coalition against Daesh, co-chairing along with Germany and later with the US, its working group on stabilization, which played a role or a crucial role in helping stabilized areas liberated from Daesh and provided key support to UNDP-led stabilization and reconstruction initiatives in Iraq in since 2015. Obviously, Daesh has been quite successful over social media, and that was one of the concerns for the UAE. The UAE is also taking a stance on kind of clarifying in 2014 who they see as terrorist actors. They published 83, or the UAE cabinet published a list of 83 designated terrorist organizations, including the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a number of other organizations. Obviously, this fulfills a particular purpose. First, it officially and publicly lays out in a transparent manner the groups that are formally considered to be terrorists. It also stipulates that any association with these terrorist groups, open or clandestine, will have severe consequences for nationals and residents. And by blacklisting these groups, the UAE demonstrates to the international community its commitment to combating terrorism and extremism domestically and internationally. Now, of course, the UAE is also demonstrated its proficiency and its reputation as one of the more competent or effective militaries in the Gulf. It stands out in comparison to other Arab countries for its modern advanced weaponry, such as drones, missile defense, warships, and over the years, it's also garnered a lot of experience in numerous offensive military developments or deployments and exercises in such areas like Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Libya. And they've also been able to train alongside important NATO counterparts to reach regionally unusual high levels of combat efficiency. So as part of GSAD, the UAE also co-chaired the Working Group on Strategic Communication, whose mission has been to oppose Daesh's narrative and undermine the appeal of its ideology. And what comes to mind here as a key initiative is the establishment of the Sawab Center, which is a joint UAE-US digital communication hub to combat extremist ideologies online and to provide a counter narrative. So again, its mission is to raise awareness among social media users and to counter the spread of Daesh's propaganda messages online. So this is done via releasing videos and Twitter messages in English and Arabic in the UAE via the center, and promote an alternative voice to that of Daesh. To complement Sawab, the UAE has also initiated an international dialogue on countering extremism by establishing the Global Center for Excellence in Countering Violent Extremism that provides communities and governments around the world with tools to increase their capabilities to counter extremism, and also the establishment of Hidayat, which was also kind of at the center of that effort. Now, another initiative or another kind of pillar of the UAE's efforts is in promoting the notion of tolerance, meaning tolerance has been identified as a way to tackle extremist ideologies. It's shown great leadership as a country that's led by example through the establishment of the Ministry of Tolerance, the construction of an Abrahamic house in Abu Dhabi, and having mosques along synagogues, the Pope Francis' visit in 2019. All of these are testimony of the UAE's efforts to promote moderate Islam and also highlight the notion of diversity, multiculturalism, and as being a key component in the battle against extremism. Now, finally, another element of confronting extremism in all its forms has involved taking a firm stance against political Islam. meaning Islamist groups whose ideologies oftentimes have inspired terrorist organizations, including, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood and those that regionally support them. Another key theme or ingredient for regional stability has been the efforts by the UAE to promote principles and mechanisms required for the establishment of a new, more stable Middle East regional order, a kind of a regional order that would be established around three core principles. The first would be the need to ensure respect for national sovereignty and an end to interference in domestic affairs of other countries in the region. So this has led to repeated calls for countries in the region, in particular, thinking here of Iran, but also others, to stop meddling and threatening to interfere in the country's internal domestic affairs. Obviously, from the UAE's perspective, Iran's destabilizing influence has been spreading, as evidenced by its support for Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian civil war, its military support for the Houthis and the Yemeni civil war, along with its relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the popular mobilization forces in Iraq. So Iran, from this perspective, has been fomenting unrest, supporting Shia groups in various Gulf states. And so again, this would be one prime example. And of course, the outbreak of a major war in the region would not be in the interest of the UAE and would carry dire implications for its economic and security interests. And so from their view, Iran's repeated attacks against, for example, oil tankers might be understood as targeting Emirati and Saudi oil exports, but they're also viewed as terrorist acts that are meant to sabotage attempts by the UAE to de-escalate tensions in the region. Second, developing strong regional multilateral institutions, mechanisms, and norms that can support the peaceful resolution of disputes between states and encourage countries to solve or resolve any internal conflicts through political dialogue. So here the emphasis is on preventive diplomacy. And when we look at examples of the GCC role in peaceful transitions, let's say in Sudan or in Eritrea and Ethiopia, these are prime examples of this particular approach. The UAE has also joined most UN organizations and affiliates, as well as regional Arab and Islamic organizations such as the Organization of the Islamic Conference and obviously created the GCC. The UAE has taken part in international peacekeeping and humanitarian interventions in order to maintain regional security, but also to signal the country's sense of international responsibility. The third core principle is related to the efforts to build a core of strong, moderate countries that are stable, well-governed, and deliver to their people or for their people. So, again, countries like Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on come to mind, this type of alliance or coalition of these particular countries. So again, the idea is on building a more inclusive, accountable, and viable state that would help address some of these key long-term problems that I've mentioned earlier on, concerns about governance, the lack of development opportunities, and so on and so forth. So the emphasis is truly on regional stability from the UAE's perspective. Now, this was supported and buttressed by the UAE's foreign policy, in particular through development assistance. And by that, I mean, obviously, contributing and supporting international development programs by providing foreign aid. The UAE has regularly exceeded the UN target of 0.7% of its annual gross national income allocated as development assistance, and is in the range of 1% actually, which is above the recommended 0.7%. From 2010 to 2021, it's donated a total of 55.6 billion US dollars in assistance to a number of different countries and different projects. And of course, what comes to mind here is the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development that was already in place around the formation of the UAE. In 2016, the UAE drafted its first foreign aid strategy in order to provide a better and more effective assistance to countries in need. So broadly speaking, the UAE's foreign aid strategy is based on three pillars: humanitarian aid, development aid, and charity. Finally, efforts to promote stability in the region and beyond has also been done through establishing strategic relationships with extra-regional countries and non-Arab states. By that, I mean the UAE has developed a solid partnership with the United States and has strongly supported US engagement in the region as a way to further solidify regional stability. Of course, there have been, over the past 2 decades, important moments of doubt over Washington's willingness to and capability to remain in the region as the main security provider. There's been talk about retrenchment, but I think overall the partnership still remains fairly strong today. At the same time, the UAE has also actively sought to diversify its partnerships with other major powers, particularly those having increasing influence in the Gulf and the Middle East. In recent years, the UAE has rapidly expanded its ties with India and other partners in Asia, such as China, South Korea, Japan, and of course with Russia. So here, the talk is usually about the pivot to the East, but it's not just a bilateral framework, but also operating in a broader multilateral context, cooperation on energy with OPEC Plus to guarantee stability in market price and to ensure security of energy supply and free flow of oil to the world market. So these are in essence the basic pillars and directives of UAE foreign policy. I'll leave it at that.
Right, fantastic, very good. That means your tolerance is the core of coexistence in the region, and security depends on the actors, on the people, on the states' behavior and approach towards security and peace. Now we move to Dr. Nikolai. We look forward to listening to you, Dr. Nikolai. Please go ahead. Can you hear me, Dr. Nikolai?
Yes, yeah, I had to unmute. Sorry for the delay. Well, I would like to talk more about the Russian vision of the current situation and the current environment in the Gulf and Russian approach to the existing security challenges, because I think this is the main issue at the moment.
Right.
And well, first of all, I have to say that for Russia, since at least 1990s, the Gulf is a very interesting potential partner in many spheres, in economy, in politics, even in the scientific domain. And currently, well, Moscow is very much concerned by the growing tensions, by the growing hostility in this region. But on the other hand, it is seen as a window of opportunity for establishing closer relationship with the Gulf states, with all the Gulf states, I have to say. This is one of the key principles of Russia, because Russia is trying to avoid being part of some kind of a camp. You know, sometimes we hear in the Arab media that Russia supports Shia camp or Sunni camp. Well, Russian foreign policy and Russian Middle East policy is not about being part of some kind of a camp. Well, anyhow, Russia sees a window of opportunity, and it wants to have closer relations with the Gulf states. But it also understands that at the current moment, it will be very difficult to achieve this goal without easing the tensions that exist in the Gulf region. Well, by the way, I have to say to Dr. Christian, we also use this theory of regional security complexes, and we also try to see the region as not as a combination of three sub-regions, but now we see growing stronger interconnections between them. So we also use this approach. But anyhow, speaking about the situation in the Gulf, Russia, from the Russian perspective, the current situation in the Gulf and in the Middle East in general very much resembles the situation we could see in the world globally during the Cold War. But now this Cold War is taking place on the regional scale. So Russian officials and Russian foreign policy thinkers decided that it would be useful to apply the same tools that were used during the Cold War in order to decrease the tensions. So what was proposed, so to say? First of all, we could see that states of the region often overestimate the military capabilities of their opponents. And very often they believe that there is a threat of a surprise attack, and that can easily provoke a preemptive war, for example. This alone is a very dangerous aspect. So, and of course, we can see that such fears are common in the Gulf. So, something has to be done about that. Then we can see that very often countries of the region misjudge the opponent's strategy. And well, for example, from the Russian perspective,
yeah, the Russian perspective on the security rather than the specific units of the system or the security complex. What is Russia's perspective on security in generally speaking, and also on the arrangements and interactions between units in within each other and with the relationship with Russia?
Yes, okay. So anyhow, we can see that there are many reasons for increased tension and conflict, and there is mistrust. There is, as I said, overestimation of opponents' capabilities. So, from the Russian perspective, it is very difficult to overcome quickly the geopolitical rivalry between Iran
Right,
and its neighbors. So
Mhm.
we have to create an environment which will be which which will allow us and the countries of the region to at least lower this tension. There must be an environment that makes dialogue possible, that makes communication possible. So Russia promotes, Russia proposed several initiatives for stabilizing the Gulf. And all those initiatives, starting from 2001, when Iraq was the major problem, and then later this initiative was adopted or adjusted to solve the Iranian nuclear problem. So anyhow, Russia focused on transparency, especially in the military sphere, and confidence building measures. And
Right.
that is why Russia is promoting a new security architecture in the Gulf. And the idea is that instead of trying to isolate Iran or Tehran, it is necessary to establish dialogue and to make sure that there is always a communication channel between two parties. This is the beginning. Then Russia is also talking about a step-by-step approach, which will be based, first of all, on trust-building measures and on cooperation in spheres that are not very much politicized, like navigation security, fighting organized crimes, fighting drug trafficking, fighting terrorism. So these areas can be cooperation in these areas can be beneficial to all of the Gulf states, not only to the GCC, but also to the Iranians. It can be also beneficial for the Iraqis. So they also need to be on board. And
Right.
so the goal is to create a mechanism in the end, which will be similar to either the Organization for Security and Cooperation, which exists in Europe nowadays, or also there was a Helsinki Pact signed in 1970s, which allowed
75. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly 75, which allowed to actually make rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US more civilized. You know, at least to have some rules, to have some red lines. And what was very important and which does not exist in the Gulf, there must be transparency on the military level, and there must be meal-to-meal communications channels. You know, for example, there is no organization that can provide now emergency communication channel in case some incidents happen. This is very problematic. It must be done either through intermediaries or or it will take lots of time because there are no we often don't there are no even communication direct communication channel. But if there is some kind of an organization where representatives, for example, of Saudi Arabia and Iran can meet and talk to each other, that will be a breakthrough. especially considering the current situation. And there
Right.
must be, of course, what Russia is also promoting, a human aspect, because there are, well, speaking about the regional security complexes theory, there is always this securitizing issue, and both sides are actually demonizing their opponents. That must be stopped, because public opinion matters, and it can be also solved
Right.
through regional mechanisms.
So you see, do you see the Lavrov initiative or the Russian initiative for establishing a comprehensive peace in the region in 2019? How do you see that in terms of achieving Russia's, objectives and interests in collaboration on peace, as you say, in the Middle East or in the Gulf in particular?
Well, from the Russian point of view, the rivalry in the Gulf is only a part of a broader picture in the region, but it affects the situation in the whole region. And for Russia, there are priorities that have to be solved. For example, Syria. Syria is also very important for Russia, because we can see that this conflict is in a stalemate, and there is a very dangerous status quo. But without without bringing on board the Gulf states, without normalizing relations between the Gulf states and Turkey, without normalizing relations between the Gulf states and Iran, it won't be possible to solve the Syrian issue. And we also see that Iraq is very vulnerable as well. So for Russia, solving the crisis in the Gulf will mean that there will be a chance to lower the tensions in the region as a whole. But the problem currently, there is a problem that Russian approach is, as I said, is step by step. So Russia insists that, first of all, we need to revive the nuclear deal as it was signed, without without adding other preconditions or some kind of reservations, like let's also discuss Iranian proxies, ballistic missiles program. That should be discussed and that should be solved, but only after reviving the nuclear deal, because without this nuclear deal, there will never be at least hope for mutual trust. And at the current moment, what we see from Moscow is that the Iranians are very stubborn. They engaged in this policy of maximum resistance, and unless the nuclear issue is solved, unless the JCPOA is revived, we don't see a chance that any tension will really reduce. On the contrary, the Iranians seem to be quite willing to continue with the current level of resistance and engagement in all the regional hotspots that are there. And speaking about things that Dr. Christian mentioned. He mentioned several very interesting things about the UAE policy towards this region. And by the way, this is the thing that Russia is also trying to promote, especially in terms of fighting political Islam or fighting extremism, because Russia is also facing this threat of Islamism, of radical Islamism, and the threat of Daesh is also something Russia is very much concerned with. So there are more than one sphere for cooperation between Russia and the Gulf states in security, and it's not only on the regional scale, it might be also on the global scale.
Right, Dr. Nikolai, the Gulf states, you mentioned that the Gulf states and Iran have a chance to come together and work together, and you spoke about the possibilities of engagement. Actually, the Gulf states globally now, they have good relationship with, or good relations, international relations with almost globally. They have good relationship with everybody. The UAE, for example, has just signed a peace deal with Israel, and for the generation, for the children of the Middle East. So the Gulf states are doing their part in terms of achieving security and stability for the region. Now, what is your view on the nuclear file, the Iran deal. I mean, this has been since 2003, on and off. And I'll ask you kindly this question: what do you think in case of the solving this Iran deal, and we have a solution and everybody is happy? How do you see Iran in terms of its intervention, its support for militias in the region? How do you see Iran behaving or doing business with its neighbors after the Iran deal is solved? What do you think from the Russian perspective?
Well, from the Russian perspective, the issue of proxy, the issue of ballistic missiles, those issues should be discussed with the Iranians on a very extensive scale. But from the Russian point of view, it will be a mistake to interconnect the nuclear issue with other issues, because we see, as I mentioned previously, we see reviving GCPOA as a confidence building measure, the first step to rebuild the confidence, and then to go discussing other issues. Because we can understand that for the Gulf monarchies, the policy of Iran is viewed as a threat. And but on the other hand, we also think that the Iranian regional expansion is, to at least a certain degree, is a response to the policy that Iran is actually experiencing. I mean, the pressure on behalf of the United States, first of all, and its allies. This is important. Reduction of pressure on Iran will create favorable conditions for actually changing Iranian policy, but it will be very naive to expect that the Iranians will agree to leave all the countries where they are now playing important role. And from a certain degree, we can also see that this is a very paradoxical thing even from the Russian point of view. But we can see that for the Gulf monarchies, it is much easier to normalize with Israel nowadays than to normalize with the Iranians. We can see even from Moscow how deep this controversy in the Gulf is. We can understand that. But on the other hand, we can see that without finding this regional balance of interests, without recognizing at least some of the Iranian grievances or some of the Iranian demands, it won't be possible to achieve a regional detente, because what we speak about now is only a regional detente. We are not naive to expect that there will be a full-scale reconciliation. That'll take time.
Right. Right. So very good. Now the question is about, well, giving Iran the opportunity to integrate in the region. Recently, China signed a deal with Iran of $400 billion for about 25 years. Do you see that as an approach or a step forward into integrating Iran into the region, and how does that affect Russia's approach to Iran and to the region, to Arab countries in the Gulf?
Well, from the Russian perspective, this deal between Iran and China is actually a positive step, because we can see that in general, China is playing a more active role in the region. China, and we actually support the Chinese approach, because their principle is stability through development. They clearly emphasize economic tools, and so we here in Moscow hope that if China is engaged deeper in this region, it can actually act as a mediator if necessary, because we know that there is also a Chinese initiative which is quite similar to what Moscow proposed. And so all the external players are concerned with the situation. And so if China is is engaging deeper, that's great, because there will be one more player, one more influential player that can actually help to solve this problem. And you know, I've been to Beijing, and we discussed there the current situation in the Gulf, and there were also ideas that working on the issue of the regional stability, not only in the Gulf but in the Middle East in general. For example, China and Russia can cooperate because the Chinese have the economic tools, while Russia is more efficient in using military or political tools or diplomatic tools. So both great powers can cooperate, and they can have some positive influence on the situation in the region. So Russia only welcomes Chinese engagement.
Right. I have this question related to the health security. You mentioned security threats in general. Now I want to ask kindly about the non-traditional health and non-traditional security threats. And the United Arab Emirates and Russia signed a deal in October 2019 worth of $1.3 billion, which includes energy, advanced technology, and health sector. Now with the pandemic as a non-traditional security threat, how does that bring together Russia and the GCC countries to cooperate or to mandate a new way of dealing with the non-traditional security threats?
Well, I can tell you that if we take Russian foreign policy strategy in general, we can see that Russia wants to become to be a supplier of technologies and services that are critical for the sovereignty of states. This is one of the key principles of Russian foreign policy strategy. And the COVID pandemic and Russia's ability to develop, to quickly develop, by the way, an efficient vaccine, it was seen also as a window of opportunity and as a chance to increase Russia's global prestige. So Russia is actually very anxious to cooperate with other countries, because I can tell you honestly, Russia has limited production capacity in terms of producing the vaccine. And what is produced locally is mostly consumed locally now, because vaccination is going on. But the Sputnik 5, for example, or Sputnik V, has a very serious advantage because it's relatively cheap. It's like $10 per injection, and it will be affordable to very many countries. And what is more important, Russia is ready to transfer the technology of production. So that will be a basis for cooperation, not only with the Gulf states, but also with other countries of the world, because, or with the region, for example. Sputnik was improved at least in 8 countries of the Middle East, including Egypt, Algeria, Iraq, and by the way, the United Arab Emirates. And what Russia is looking now for is a logistical hub for the supply of Sputnik to the region. I heard that Saudi Arabia could be such a logistical hub, but other people told me that the UAE was also considered as a potential logistical hub. So vaccine diplomacy is important for Russia, and Russia is really keen to show the difference between Russia and, for example, the Western countries, because in the West, the vaccine technology is owned by private companies, while in Russia, this is mostly done by the government, and technologies can be easily transferred to the countries that need those technologies. So,
can I move to Dr. Christian for a question, please?
Sure.
Dr. Christian, you spoke or you talked in your presentation about the pillars of UAE foreign policy in terms of security. How has the pandemic impacted the UAE, and how do you evaluate the impact of non-traditional security threats? Such the same question I asked to.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, similar to what Nikolai just mentioned. I mean, obviously there are other non-traditional security threats in the GCC, we're talking about, usually we talk about country to country or non-state actor threats, but of course there are issues like food security, water security, human security, and of course health security was previously closely linked in the UAE with issues like diabetes or obesity, but that's been obviously shifted to the concerns over COVID-19. So again, I think the UAE, in terms of vaccine diplomacy, is trying to kind of establish itself as one of the major regional, if not international actors. So strengthening its relationship with major vaccine producers that allowed the UAE to benefit from first mover advantage in COVID vaccine stakes. So the country was an early participant in both the Chinese and Russian COVID vaccine trials, and has deepened its reliance on the Chinese vaccine by starting the vaccination of its frontline medical workers in September 2020 and expanding the approval for general use in 2020. Of course, part of the UAE COVID-19 strategy is to become a global vaccine transportation and distribution hub. And this is something Nicola had just mentioned. So obviously, in inoculations arriving from manufacturing hubs such as India, the UAE stores them, redistributes them by flying smaller amount of loads to other countries. Obviously, because of its aviation infrastructure, both Abu Dhabi and Dubai have become dominant commercial and transportation hubs, and they've, obviously fulfilled a certain function. And the recent decision to establish a production center of the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine in the UAE clearly kind of, in a sense, epitomizes the country's willingness to be a leading actor in the transition towards a post-COVID or post-coronavirus world and expanding its vast growing markets in Asia. So again, I think along similar lines, the UAE is trying to establish a foothold in terms of vaccine diplomacy.
Right. I go back to Nikolai, Dr. Nikolai, please, with the question on the Helsinki Accords. You mentioned, Dr. Nikolai, that it's desirable to sign similar to Helsinki Accord in the Middle East, which is the Russian idea. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the Helsinki Accords were a process. It took a long time before they were signed in 1975. And the conditions were different in terms of 35 states, European states signed on the accord. It's not a binding, but they signed on it and they followed the terms. Now, in terms of Iran, I don't see you were highlighting Iran's grievances and the pressure on Iran, but since 2003, the start of the nuclear deal, Iran has a lot of problems within its own domestic environment in terms of politics. They are the revolutionary, and there are the peaceful side, and there are those who stand on the fence. So Iran does have problems within itself. That does not allow Iran to reach a comprehensive deal with anybody. So the China deal, for example, the deal that Iran signed with China recently had a lot of objection within Iran. There were protests inside Iran objecting to signing the deal because they told the government that don't sign a deal that would be similar to the Russians before. So you mentioned the grievances of Iran, but Dr. Nikolai, let's speak about the mm-hmm. current facts. Mm-hmm. The Gulf states have signed peace. They are known for their track record of maintaining. And as Dr. Christian mentioned, there is a Ministry of Tolerance in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. There is a ministry of, there is a Ta'ayush Silmi, this to live in peace with everybody. It's the motto, it's the principle of the country. Now, achieving peace in your perspective, don't you think that Iran is taking a step back while others taking a step forward?
Well, the only thing I can tell you now is that the result of the previous policy, which was enacted very much by Donald Trump, for example, since 2017, the result will be a possible victory of an ultra-conservative candidate during the presidential elections this year. And that will bring much more trouble for the Gulf monarchies in the future. And this is the result of this very, very short-sighted policy, because there was an agreement, there was JCPOA, and it was a chance to establish at least some confidence with the Iranians, and later to start negotiating other things, including their regional activities. But instead, somehow, I'm not, by the way, I'm not talking about the UAE. I'm personally an admirer of the UAE foreign policy. And from the Russian perspective, by the way, the UAE is an example of a really balanced and a very efficient regional policy. But some of your neighbors, they are much more hostile towards the Iran. And we can see that the UAE is actually trying to have some dialogue with the Iranians as well.
Right.
But some of your neighbors, they are much more hostile towards the Iranians, and they cooperated with the Americans. And what we saw, for example, there's a very simple thing. There were huge, massive arms sales to this region, which made the Iranians feel vulnerable. And we need also, you know, there is also this issue of arms race that has to be addressed.
Yes, yes. Dr. Nikolai, I understand your perspective, because you started basically with the notion of the Cold War. And once you started with the notion of the Cold War, that means you eliminated or you nullified peaceful for dialogue and for a good chance of peace. However, I want to ask the two of you finally to brief in a minute each about the future security of the region. How does it look like, emphasizing the peace and the work for peace in the region? I start with you, Dr. Nikolai, please.
So I think that the work for peace must include, first of all, establishing some kind of a platform where countries of the region can have dialogue. This platform must also provide emergency communication channels in order to prevent confrontations. And there must be, of course, cooperation in some secondary spheres, but it is important. And of course, reviving the JCPOA. This is the primary thing that must be done in order to at least reduce the tensions to the level we had 10 years ago. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And Dr. Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. I mean, I think there will be competing different conceptions with regards to identification, assessment, and prioritization of existing and emerging threats. Each country will have their own, you know, particular perceptions of what they see as being threatening or non-threatening. And of course, that undermines the possibility of establishing a more inclusive collective security agreement or arrangement. So I think along the same lines as Dr. Surkov, what's important is to kind of find a common platform or a certain medium through which not just GCC countries, but other Middle Eastern countries, along with states like China, Russia, and the United States, can somehow find reasonable solutions to the ongoing problems.
Right. Right. Let me finally remind that the founder and the man who made peace, lasting peace in the region, is Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan, the founder of United Arab Emirates, and his contributions to history are now viewed from what he said and did about that peace is made by men. By men means men and women, by man. Peace, men and women make peace. Systems do not necessarily make peace, but men and women. And if you see how the end of the Cold War came to an end, or how you see the 50 years peace or 60 years all peace in Europe, it is made by generations of people working for peace. And the United Arab Emirates in particular has worked hard all the time to achieve peace, not only for the UAE, but for the regional, for the world peace. On this notion, I thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Nikolai Surkov from the Russian Federation, and Dr. Christian from Trends Organization, Research and Advisory. And we thank Trends and Advisory for the platform, for the opportunity to have this discussion, and we hope to see you again in the future for a further conversation on these important topics. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.